Hello, this is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady. I love my all-in-one loom, as I'm sure you do. But when knitting single stockinette, you pretty much have one gauge that you can use. It works very well for worsted yarn. And I got to thinking it is so neat that we can adjust the gauge with double knitting stockinette. Wouldn't it be nice if we could adjust the gauge for single stockinette? But since the pegs are a certain size at a certain spacing, how are we going to do that? And it occurred to me, you know I'm a machine knitter also, that on knitting machines, if we want to change the gauge beyond the ability of the machine, we do so by skipping needles. And up to the point that the hook on a knitting machine needle can hold the yarn, you can get by with that, giving a dramatic change to the gauge. So I thought, let's try it on the authentic knitting board. And here you see me using a really bulky yarn on the board. Let's cast on using every other needle. It's exactly like any other cast on, except that we just pretend that the alternate needles don't exist. So I'm laying my loop on the first needle, wrapping the third, wrapping the fifth, wrapping the seventh, and so on, all the way around. When you get to a corner, just keep counting needles. There's actually already work on this board, so I can't wrap around the corner, but you get the idea. I was just now showing you the E-wrap cast on, but any cast on that you used would be done in the same manner. Be sure that your yarn comes behind the pegs that you're ignoring, that is, towards the inside of the loom, because otherwise the stitches will get stuck on the outside. You'll see why in a minute, because now we're going to knit. We go outside of a peg we're going to use, inside a peg we're not going to use, and weave in this manner all the way across. Super important not to get the stitches too tight. So if you can control your tightness, go ahead and weave all the way across the loom, as I'm doing here. But if you find that you tend to get overly tight, just do one or two stitches at a time until you get the feel of the correct tautness. You don't want your stitching to be stiff and tight, especially since the point of using every other needle is to use very bulky yarn. And in general, that's very unpleasant to wear, a garment made out of bulky yarn that's extremely tightly knitted. Not to mention it's hard on the hands and stressful for the loom pegs. Of course, I'm using the flat stitch here, but any stitch that you wanted to use, you would prepare in the same way. If, for example, I wanted to purl this stitch, I could do so. There you go. But I don't want to purl it, so I'm going to put it back. I'm knitting a real hat here. This hat's going to go to a charity that I participate in that distributes hats in Maine to people who don't have them. A thought that is just terrible to me, to go through a Maine winter hatless. And I have a friend that runs a charity, so I try to contribute 100 hats every year. If this is something that interests you, you can read more about it on my blog, because you are more than welcome to participate. And I know that the charity would be delighted. One cool thing about knitting for a charity is that people aren't picky. You can use your odds and ends. Here we go around the corner. Use your leftover yarns. Use the simplest pattern. Practice a stitch, and if it isn't perfect, nobody's going to criticize. Here's what the fabric is like. I'm going to put my fingers and the tool on top of it so you can see the comparative gauge. This, by the way, is Charisma Chunky Yarn by Loops and Threads. I think this, even among number 5 yarns, which is what it is one of the bulkier ones. You get it at Michael's, and it is very soft and pleasing to work with. You may find the necessity to weave in and out a little bit puzzling, because if you were just knitting the flat stitch, you would be able to lay the yarn across as you see it laying now and just keep knitting. So I will show you why that would be problematic. You can knit all right, as I am doing, but now look, each of the needles we didn't want to use is wrapped, and in order to make the stitch work we would have to lift these manually across each needle, and it's so much easier to do that before the stitches have been knitted. Otherwise the fabric would hang up on the outside of the knitting, and it would eventually make a snarl that you had no way of dealing with. I think it's possible that there is a fancy stitch to be developed in the outside wrap method, possibly something that looked like a slip stitch. You couldn't go indefinitely, it would be one decorative row, and that's something to play with for another day. But for today I'm just interested in, can we knit a really bulky yarn on the all-in-one loom, giving us another gauge, and obviously we can. I hope you're excited by the possibilities that this opens up as I am. Knit lots of hats, everything else too, and have fun. Happy knitting, and bye now.